During the mid-2000s, the PlayStation 2 saw many experimental games being developed and released on the console that took a chance on exploring very unusual yet very controversial ideas that would be brought into the gaming world, some of which would end up being successful while others would fall under the radar, pretty much leaving into the realm of obscurity, but yet at the same time would garner somewhat of a following and provide a culture all of its own that still holds strong even by today. And yet many of these games, while relatively unheard of for most people, they also have provided much influence with regards to many new and upcoming indie games or indie horror games that you now see being developed on newer consoles, anything from the likes of Steam to itch.io. Many creative aspects are born from these unusual but yet original ideas, and Michigan Report from Hell is one of those obscure and unique games that manages to capture all of the essence of these ideas that started all the way back in 2004, being released in Japan for the PlayStation and later in Europe in 2005, that sees the plot revolve around a mysterious fog in a nearby town close to Lake Michigan, covered in a very unusual dark and dense fog that is causing havoc, with reports of people transforming into hideous, vile and grotesque monsters, and no one knows the reasons behind this event. So the game requires you to play as a number of different television crew personnel, where you are sent to investigate this occurrence and to understand the origins behind this deadly fog or what has caused it to develop the devastating effects that it has on the local town. The game is played from a first person perspective, and ideally you play as the actual cameraman yourself, and you are accompanied by a number of different reporters that all have their own character traits and story arcs, and during the course of the game many of these reporters can also have a massive influence or impact on the game's story, as there's a multitude of different endings that are available, and depending on who lives or survives, with some of the reporters that can be killed off, will determine some of these endings. And what usually happens throughout play is that if a reporter is killed in the next scenario or level in the game, you will be accompanied with another reporter that is sent in to also help you out. So the game and the story will just continue on from there. So during your journey, you are tasked with surveying your environments, but also trying to find out and learn of any potential threats, but also to find items of interest that can be used to uncover the events or the reality of what is causing this fog to transform people into the monsters that are roaming around the town. And the game, with all of its elements, provides a very different and very unique approach to the survival horror style gameplay, as it's played mostly from a first person perspective, with various gameplay elements where you have to run, either hide, search for items of interest, explore your environments, but also with different sections or scenes where enemies are invading certain areas. Some of the reporters will have access to weapons, so what you have to do is you have to use your camera to guide or to tell the reporters of where to point and shoot their weapons in order to destroy the enemies that are approaching. And obviously this has to be done within a certain time frame, or you have to kill all enemies within the area in order for everyone to survive. The game itself does provide a very dark approach with regards to first person horror, and when we think back, there were very few games during that time, even going back to like the PlayStation 1, there were very few titles out there that really tried to emphasise the whole idea of first person horror and to try and create some sort of atmosphere out of it. So this was one of the first initial games or unusual games to try and do that. While it executed many good ideas, it was sadly let down with regards to the clunky control systems, which resulted in the game receiving mixed to average reviews at the time, and the controls were one of the key downfalls of the entire experience. Many suggesting that they were quite clunky and very difficult and awkward to understand and use during play. In many cases that the control systems were the cause of characters dying as you played, because you wouldn't be able to react to certain elements quick enough, or wouldn't be able to find interactive elements in ways that you probably could do through other types of control systems. And we have to remember as well that back at that time, first person games, even with like first person shooters or these type of first person horror games, The control systems were very average, as they still hadn't fully understood the whole emphasis of control features within games, a feat that wouldn't be really made possible until later console generations or gaming generations. Sometimes you still often see today many indie games have a tendency with developers wanting to use these clunky style of control systems, either using keyboard and mouse or to use similar styles that would have been seen on these earlier type of games. And from my own personal experience, the games and the ideas are really good, but when you go to play them and control them, the controls are terrible. I'm not going to deny that for a second. And that can be the difference between having a really good experience or a very poor experience. So a lot of these elements really boils down to the control elements of the game. So if you can get that right, that will make the difference. But regardless of the reviews, the game has presented somewhat of a cultural following and has perceived to be a massive influence with regards to many unique story-driven ideas, many of which you can see today. Like if we look at games that came out around the likes of the early days of the PlayStation 4 console with the likes of Outlast and a couple of other first-person survival horror games, the use in those games is to walk around using a camera or a phone where you record all of the elements that are happening. And the funny thing is, many of those elements that you would see in those iconic games were already perceived with Michigan Report from Hell, but just wouldn't be emphasised or just made better until later generations. But still, this game does present a very early take on that type of premise for a survival horror game, and it does it quite well to some degree, but just not executed as well as it could have been. But still, it helped to pave the way for many unique and very scary titles that we now see today. So when we look at it in the grand scheme of things, without Michigan Report from Hell, many of these very unique survival horror first-person games probably wouldn't exist today without it. So when we really think about it, these ideas had to generate and come from somewhere. And this game definitely did have an impact on first-person horror, with the developers themselves even stating that they liked the idea of the game and they wanted to revisit it, even remaster it in recent years, or even make a sequel. So it does have enough concepts and premise and appeal around it that it is a series that in many cases is worth revisiting. And you never know, someday we might actually see a complete overhaul of the game on modern systems. So that would be really cool for that to happen, but you never know. It has many cool concepts and story elements with exploration and all of the above. Just the control systems are really the key feature that lets the game down in many respects. But even with that, the game in itself in Japan was one of the best selling games during that current year, as it was well received. Just everywhere else it wasn't. But we have to come back to a time when a lot of these games were experimental. A lot of these type of titles didn't really hit home with different types of audiences. Like even I've mentioned on previous videos, even on my other PlayStation 1 channel, a lot of these earlier type of games didn't go down too well with different types of audiences, especially in the European region, and mainly because we over here didn't really understand those concepts and they weren't really that appealing to us at that time. It's only now, years later, when we look back over these unique titles, that we can see the value behind them, that we can see the impact that they actually had, and we respect them for what they were able to provide to us. But back then we didn't really see that. We were so used to more mainstream titles, and anything that was experimental you nearly just kind of shoved it aside and didn't really want to entertain it at all. And it was the same during the PlayStation 2 era as well. It's only now, say 10, 15, 20 years later, that you start to understand these concepts, and the fact is people are now starting to revisit these games or even trying to gain access to them to build up either collections, or they're now playing them through emulation, and they're seeing these games for what they are. While not fully polished and probably not as well executed, but they are a very unique idea, and that's what really stands out amongst anything else. And it's only now when you compare it to newer games that you can see the whole ideas and concepts behind them, that they all started, or most of them started, with a lot of these original ideas dating back nearly 20 years. So it is interesting when we think of that alone. But still, having spent time playing Michigan Report, yes, it is clunky, but it is a very unique take on survival horror. I remember even going back myself years previous, way back during the mid-2000s. I never got to play this game myself, but there were websites that were selling the game. I remember it was a play.com at the time. Now that website's no longer around, but I do remember the game always being sold on that, and I had many opportunities to buy it, and at one point I nearly did, but for some reason I just kind of overlooked it. But looking back, I wish I had tried it. But even now we can play it with emulation, so now is the perfect time to experience the game for itself and just to see what you think. While it's not the best horror game out there, but it is a very early concept of what could have been, and like I said, it has helped to generate many ideas of some very scary games that we now see today. So it has its place in history for those ideas alone. So I would recommend, if you are looking for a different type of experience on the PlayStation 2 that provides elements of first person horror, then Michigan Report from Hell is definitely worth a look in my book. If you can get over the clunky controls, it will present a very unusual yet unique experience for sure. But aside from that, I would love to know your thoughts of this game. If you have managed to play this yourself, did you own the game back in the day, or is it one of those games that you have on your list of games that you want to try out and experience? Or are you interested in these very unusual, quirky style of survival horror games? I would love to hear your stories behind any ideas you have of the game, so be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other very unusual and yet unique and obscure titles like this that were also released on the PlayStation 2, then leave a like on the video, and also be sure to check out the playlist on screen, as there are many other very unusual titles that help to inspire many modern games that we do see today that are worthwhile trying out. And I will see you all in the next one.